Hello everyone, the Instant Camera Guy here, and welcome to an episode where I will be going through a very niche and specific issue with SX-70 Sonar type cameras that I have discovered a fix for as of probably the last 2 months or so I've been doing this. Autofocus cameras like the SX-70 Sonar, the SLR680, are really awesome, right? Because you get focusing from infinity to 10 inches in what, roughly a second? It's a really quick and amazing way to focus. Being based on sound waves, you can focus in dim light. It's a great, nifty feature. But there is a downside to this. It adds a lot of extra complication to the camera. In addition of adding a good, inch and a half to the total length of the camera, right? In addition to that, it adds a whole stack of parts inside the actual assembly. It's got a transducer, a plastic switch in the housing, it's got an internal switch, it's got a motor, it's got a clutch, it's got a whole stack of gears and cogs, it's got a whole bunch of passive components, it's got a high voltage transformer, it's got about 4 proprietary chips, and all of those things can be problematic. I don't often have many warranty repair jobs, but when I do, you can bet dollars to donuts that it has to do with an autofocus assembly. Quite often a component which, through no fault of anyone's, not my fault, not the client's fault, really just through random chance, parts on them fail. And unfortunately, that can lead to, missed focus in photos, or just an autofocus assembly that doesn't work, or that only fires at a certain, that only focuses to a certain distance. Well, I've discovered a very uncommon issue, but an issue that I found has become common enough that I'm making a video on how to repair it. In fact, it's an issue that's annoyed me so much that the fix for it that I'm about to show you guys is something that I'm now doing by default to every single client's camera, regardless of whether it has the issue or not. Now, the particular issue that I'm planning on fixing here, this particular camera doesn't have, but I'm going to describe what the issue is. For viewers of the channel that have seen my previous videos, on the episode that I did on the Polar Studio Power Mix power bar, I actually demonstrated this issue because when using the Power Mix, the camera had that problem. So I'll try and timestamp in this video exactly what section to go to in that video if you want to see this problem in action. But effectively what happens is when you take a photo, the camera, you'll press the button and the camera will focus. And then when you take the photo, when you press the button again, what happens is during that exposure, the lens suddenly continues to turn. And what that does is it means that during the exposure itself, the lens is turning. And so you end up with this sort of focus pull image, and the resultant picture is blurry and out of focus. Now, the reason that this happens is basically because of the SX-70R PCB. So, what happens, there seems to be some kind of incompatibility between the SX-70R PCB, certain variants of the Sonar assembly, and certain I-type battery adapters. And when you have all 3 of those things, plus a little dash of bad luck, you can get that issue. So sometimes the issue can be that the I-type adapter simply doesn't have enough power, and that was the case with the Power Mix. But other times, the I-type adapter will have plenty of power, and it'll focus just fine, but as the batteries get flat, the odds of that focus issue happening become greater. So, like I said, this is a very strange issue because it seems that it only affects certain sonar mechanisms. It only affects cameras that are modified to the SX-70R PCB, and it only affects cameras that are then further adapted to take I-type films, such as the Polaroid. Now the reason for the issue, if I pull out a sonar mechanism here, has to do with this little solenoid. Now this little solenoid plunges when the correct focus distance is achieved. So the cogs will spin, and let's say, they go from park position, the cogs start to spin. Well, let's say that that's the correct distance we need to focus on. Well, that solenoid plunges, right? Connecting to the cogged wheel here, preventing it from moving. So that locks the lens into a certain position. The camera then fires the shutter, the blades move, so the other solenoid is activated, so the shutter blades move, and then the camera ejects the film. Well, what I believe is happening is the SX-70R PCB, just by the nature of it being new, with a Bluetooth module, with a modern CPU, it draws more power than the original SX-70 PCB. And what I believe is happening is on some variations of the SX-70 Sonar board. So I'm not talking about the SX-70R PCB, I'm talking about this board here with its 4 proprietary chips, high voltage transformer, wires, all those different parts. It seems that some variations of these boards, when it sends power to the solenoid, it does so rather weakly. And what happens is, although the focus will trigger, right? The autofocus, that solenoid will kick in and it'll lock the lens into the correct position. Well, when the shutter then fires, the solenoid that activates the shutter draws enough power away from this solenoid that it loses its grip and the lens begins to turn again once more. Does that make sense? So in certain variations of this circuit board in the sonar assembly, when you install an SX-70R PCB and an I-type adapter, and all the planets align to give you bad luck, you can get that issue because the PCB and the main shutter solenoid are drawing more power than what this little solenoid that controls the autofocus can handle. Now, if I've completely lost you after all that, go and rewatch that segment a few times until you understand what's going on. But effectively, in a nutshell, that is what's happening. Now, the interesting thing to me is this doesn't seem to be an issue with SLR680 cameras. So I can only assume that Polaroid, when they were making different variations of these sonar boards, because if you look at enough SX-70 sonars, you'll notice that the boards have like different capacitor values, different resistors, some of them have different chips, others have like factory bodges where like a resistor is lifted and there's like extra wires added in to route power around differently. My guess is Polaroid realized that it was a problem and they redesigned the SLR680 so that that kind of thing didn't happen. And in the SLR680, you've obviously got to consider that there's a big flash capacitor in there, drawing a lot of power, and that could be interfering with the electronics. So my assumption is that Polaroid realized, ooh, we're not exactly sending enough power to this solenoid at the back, we need to beef up the components. And so, as I said, this will only affect certain variants of the SX-70 Sonar board. Now, as for what revisions it affects, I honestly don't know. There is too much variation, and there's too little documentation on sonar parts for me to give a rough, accurate estimate. Fortunately, I have found a fix that solves this issue, and the best part about it is this fix can be installed on cameras that even don't have that issue without detrimentally affecting performance. So basically what I'm trying to say is this particular fix can only improve the camera. It does not hinder the camera at all. So what are you going to need for this fix? Well, not a lot, fortunately. You are going to need 2 little pieces of wire. Now I'm using the same thin gauge of wire that I use in my polar volt battery conversions. This is about the thickness of wire that you would get if you spliced into like a computer monitor cable. It is not the same thickness of wire that you would get, say, on a battery holder, right? Because AAA battery holders, for example, they tend to come with very thick, chunky wire. It is certainly a gauge thinner than that. That's the kind of wire that I'm going to be using. The next thing that I'm going to need is a capacitor. And I've chosen some through-hole capacitors. These are, I think, Nichicons? Rubicons. Just a good quality capacitor brand. And the value that we're looking for is at least 1,000 microfarads. Now, I also have some 1,500 microfarad capacitors. The thing that you have to make sure is that the diameter of the capacitor is at least is 8 millimeters, because 1,000 microfarad capacitors come in a few different shapes and sizes, and if you get one that's really fat, it's not going to fit inside the sonar housing. So you have to make sure it's a capacitor at least 1,000 microfarads. You want it to be 8 millimeters in diameter, and you want it to be at least 10 volts. You can get these capacitors in 6 volts, but that is much too close to the 6 volt rating that the camera uses. Remember, the voltage rating in a capacitor stands for the maximum voltage that the capacitor can handle. So you always want the voltage value higher than the voltage you're going to use. If you use 6 volts, you're going to want at least 10 volts. If you have a 12 volt circuit board, you're going to want a 25 volt capacitor, right? The capacitor value you use has to be larger than what you're using, or else the components will fail over time. So like I said, 10 volt, 16 volt, 1,000 microfarads. The capacitance, the microfarad value, is the important part. You want at least 1,000. That is it. Now, to do this fix, basically there is just enough room in this part of the sonar housing in order to fit this component. And effectively, what we are going to do is install it, run wires and tap them into positive and negative. And what that's going to do is, when the camera is erect, 6 volts is going to flow into this capacitor and be stored as a charge. And that extra stored charge is enough to keep that solenoid activated during the autofocus. And that's going to prevent that slipping of the gears and focus issues. As I said, it's completely fine to install this even if your camera is perfectly working. And I'm actually doing this on every client sonar type camera that's been sent to me from this moment forwards. Now, if you like my business and my channel, and you like supporting companies that have a positive impact to the retro community, whether it be computers, cameras, or anything else old and electronic, then you'll probably like this week's sponsor, PCBWay. Now, if you don't know, PCBWay is a manufacturer of printed circuit boards, and they have been providing the retro electronics community a way to manufacture small runs of PCBs for well over a decade by now. And honestly, I'm really chuffed that they reached out to me for a sponsorship, because not only are they a company that I've actually used before, but they are 100% a company that I can recommend. As I said, I personally used them before, not just for like little hobby projects that I was doing with computers, but also when I was making PCBs that allowed you to install like a physical switch into the SX-70 to swap between 160 and 640 ISO films. I featured that in a video before. More recently, PCBWay has also branched out into 3D printing and CNC machining, so if you need parts for a retro project that don't currently exist, you might be able to just design new versions and have PCBWay make new ones for you. So they genuinely are great to deal with. Can't recommend them enough. Links will be in the description down below. Now, on to the repair. First thing that we're going to do is attach wires to the capacitor. I've got my famous blue tack, and I'm just going to stick the capacitor there. Effectively, I'm just going to tin the legs, strip back a bit of the wire, and attach the wires. Now, I'm using black and red wires because black and red are the universal electronic sign for positive and negative. I'm going to use red for positive, black is going to be negative. If I can strip it, there we go. And I'm just going to tin the wires and tin the legs of the capacitor as well. Now, on a surface mount capacitor like this, on a through-hole capacitor, well, and on a surface mount as well, the stripy side will generally indicate negative. 99% of the time. There are incredibly rare exceptions where a company decides to buck the trend and do it the other way around, but generally, that is the way that things are done. That is the way of the universe. All right, so I have tinned the legs and the wires, and now I just have to join them together. All right. So, we now have a capacitor with wires hanging off of it. Cool. I'm going to get a bit of heat shrink just to protect those bare legs. And then we are ready to install the capacitor into the sonar housing and tap it into positive and negative. All right. All right, that part is finished. Now, this is a camera that I've refurbished earlier today. It is upgraded with the new PCB. It is upgraded with Polaroid. Everything about this thing is ready to go. The only thing I have left to do is install the capacitor. Remember that this is a job that you will be doing on a fully refurbished camera. If you've skipped the steps and are doing this first, you're doing something wrong. Make sure the camera works first. This is really like the final step. Now, I've specifically left the sonar housing on here so that you can see me take it off. Basically, we're just going to use a screwdriver or a pry tool to get under the two layers and push forwards, just taking one side off at a time. The front of the sonar housing then lifts away. The next thing that we can remove is the little plastic bracket that has the legs that hold on to the transducer. And that literally just pulls upwards. Now, on some sonar cameras, there will be two screws with the SX-70 style square screw heads. And they will go right here in the flash fire assembly socket. You won't find them on all model SX-70 sonars. Obviously, if you do, you will now need to remove those screws, but Polaroid basically discovered that they weren't necessary and deleted them on later model sonars. So it's quite common to find sonar cameras without those screws. If you find your camera without screws already, odds are it's a later model, or it was repaired back in the factory and they threw those screws away. Now, getting the rear housing off is trickier than the front housing. It certainly can be done. I'm going to give you guys a bit of a cheat here. If you really want to, what you can do is really just push the capacitor, so lift up on the board a little bit and using your finger and your thumb, separate the plastic. And if you want to, you can just drop that capacitor inside and route the wires around. I'm going to show you guys my way of doing it, which is just a bit more secure. There is enough room back there to hold the capacitor secure. So it's a nice snug fit. You don't have to worry about it rattling around, but I like to do things a little bit more extreme because I'm, super pedantic. So I like to just crack one side of the housing, basically lifting upwards and swiveling to the side, like so. And then I like to just get a pretty thick screwdriver, slide it down the other side until the other side releases. Come on. There we go. And that gives us access to the insides of the sonar assembly. Now, the capacitor is going to go right about there. So pretty much in line with the solenoid. That's where we're going to put it. All right, so the top of the capacitor should pretty much line up with the wires that go to the solenoid. So what I'm going to do is, just using a cloth with a bit of alcohol, I'm just going to clean this piece of metal here. And I'm actually going to use a little piece of double-sided tape to hold that capacitor down. As I said, you really don't need to, but I always do things to extreme degrees. So I'm going to secure it down with a bit of that same double-sided body molding tape that I use for my Polar Vault. This is a double-sided foam tape. It's incredibly strong stuff. So I'm just going to push that wire to the side. I'm going to stick down the piece of double-sided tape. We are going to lift off the other side. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to poke the wires underneath that little metal clasp first. This just, I think personally, provides a better way of routing the wires. So it's going to come through like that. We're then going to flip the capacitor. I'm going to secure it in spot. And then we can pull on those wires to bring them out and over the top. All right. Now the transducer I've just pushed to the side. Watch that you don't snap any wires on the delicate transducer when you do this job. Now we've got to tap into positive and negative. So I'm going to show you guys exactly where we're going to put the wires. So this brass switch here is the positive. So we're going to use this pad right here as the positive, and this rail right next to it is the negative. So what I like to do is put a blob of solder on this chip leg. So the side of this chip closest to the motor, the very end leg, that's negative, that's ground. The switch next to it is positive. So I'm going to add big blobs of solder either side. So a blob of solder on that final chip leg and a blob of solder on the switch here. And then we're going to run positive to positive, negative to negative. All right. So again, just tinning the other sides of these of the leads. Just use my blue tack again to hold it in place. And then we'll get a little bit creative in terms of routing these wires in just a second. All right. So what I like to do is just route the wire in such a way that it kind of goes in between the components. So I'm going to attach the end first. Then I'm going to route the cable, and then we will I will tape it down so that it can't move anywhere. All right, that's the black wire done. And the negative wire, let's give it a good position. It would go... Yeah, let's take it in from the top. It really doesn't matter, as long as the wires connect to where they're supposed to be going. So again, I'm going to bring that up and show you. So we've got that red wire going to the switch. We've got the black wire going to the first chip chip leg. And now, once you've just made sure that you haven't shorted anything out, yeah, just snake the wires around until they're nice and flat, basically. So this is the fun part. All right, so that's one down. And that's the second part. You basically just don't want the wires sticking upwards, pressing against the sonar transducer where they could get damaged. And then the last thing that I'm going to do is just to insulate everything, I'm going to put a few pieces of Kapton tape across those wires. Just to hold them down. It's actually a good idea to put Kapton tape here anyway, because the sonar transducer can short out on components on the board, which can result in failure. So this is not necessarily a bad idea to be insulating this part anyway. All right, so we've got a layer of Kapton tape holding those wires down. Red is positive, black going to negative, and again we can check on the side of the capacitor again that black is indeed going to the stripy side, red is going to the other side. Now we can put the transducer back. Now the bottom of the transducer has this little rectangular cutout. That rectangular cutout goes into that little metal tongue here. Can you see that little metal tab? Right there. So that's where we're going to slot it into. Then we can put in place the little legs. The little legs, again, they go into the little metal tongues at the top. So we're just doing this in reverse. So everything is now held down. We can see that that capacitor is sitting securely at the back. And the coolest thing is, when we reassemble this thing, everything is going to fit snug as a bug in a rug. While you're inside as well, now's the time to just take any dust that you might be seeing. So I'm seeing like quite a bit of dust that's just gotten into the housing. Now's a good time to clean that. I can also put TI CG. And it is currently August, so I'll go 0825. And that's it. Now we just put the rear housing back on. And as you can see, the capacitor sits snugly on the side there. Safe, secure, and supplying extra voltage to the motor. The front housing now just clips in place. And as you can see, everything is working exactly the same as before. Now, had we had that intermittent focusing issue, this would have now fixed that. So, I'd like to give a big shout out again to PCBWay for sponsoring this video, and I would also like to give a shout out to Linus from Linus and His Camera, another fantastic YouTube channel. Those familiar with both of our channels will know that I built Linus an SX-70 Sonar. Well, his camera, in addition to having an issue with the cam follower assembly, also had this very rare intermittent issue. And through Linus's troubleshooting, I was actually able to come up with a solution that he could implement to fix his camera. And it's now a solution that I know to do going forwards on every single person's SX-70 Sonar. Now, if you already have a sonar and it's been refurbished by me, well, odds are your camera works fine, right? Or else you would have reached out many months ago. But as I said, if it is something that you want to add to your camera as a way to preemptively correct things, well, feel free to use this video as a guide of all the different mods that you can do to SX-70s, provided that you know how to use a soldering iron well. It is on the easier side of things, although it's still a little bit complicated. I made it more complicated by taking the rear housing off. You technically don't need to, you can just kind of smush it in. That definitely works. But yeah, as long as you are connecting that capacitor to positive and negative rails, everything is going to work like normal. That capacitor, by the way, will have its charge cut when the autofocus switch is engaged. So that capacitor is only going to be engaged when the autofocus is turned on, which is another neat little feature, so it can't interfere with anything else. Well, that's it for this video. Another huge thank you to PCBWay. I hope you enjoyed this one, and I will see you guys next time.